We're looking from a lens of a couple of centuries in modern history. We're not looking at a very, very, very long-term lens, and I think some of the things here are speaking more to a long-term change in world geopolitics and world trade and world finance. All right, so I'm gonna give a topic today on the change in the gold trade. So a lot of what I talk about on GoldSilver Pros and our YouTube channel is the Great Reset and how things are changing in the gold market. I talked a lot about Basel III, the net stable funding ratio, and I'm kind of geeky with this stuff. I'm a former auditor, so I like to dive down deep into the paperwork that nobody likes to look at and find interesting stuff. And I think there are a lot of changes going on in the gold market. I think that the gold market's moving east, much to China. I think they're trying to pull it out of London, and that's what some of the Basel III regulations are about. But also something very interesting happened as we were looking at ways in which the gold trade could shift. It seems as though Texas is becoming a big player. So 4 things in regard to the Texas gold market. We're going to talk about the Texas Bullion Depository and how it's going global, not just serving Texas state residents. Talk about the setup as an alternative to New York, and that was part of the original design that was admitted by the Texas Comptroller, which I did not know when they opened it in 2018. They're actually setting Texas Bullion Depository up as an alternative to the New York depositories. How Wall Street has approached Texas for moving their markets, including NASDAQ, and we think potentially, like the S&P and stuff, to Texas, just outside of Austin, and how they're setting up data centers as infrastructure for all of this. So I'm kind of taking news from different places and putting it together and putting a thesis there. So we're going to talk about Texas first, and if I have time, we're going to talk about China, because I think there are 2 big moves going on. There's a shift within the United States, and then I think there's a shift from the traditional Western markets over more into the East. So this is from the Texas Comptroller's website, and I'm just going to read this little snippet. It says, in summer 2018, Texas began operating the nation's only state-run bullion depository, a highly secure government-backed storage facility comparable to the U.S. Bullion Depository in Fort Knox, Kentucky, which holds federal gold reserves. So they're pretty serious about this. This is not your average, everyday, like Brink's Bullion Depository. This is a pretty serious deal. It says, now the Texas Bullion Depository, which experienced a surge of deposits during COVID, aims to provide its services to a wider range of clientele, making lasting first impacts that extend well beyond the Texas border. And I originally read this article, and I was like, you know what, that's interesting. I thought it would just be for local clients, people that wanted to store their bullion locally. But they admitted that the original design of this was to move the gold trade to Texas. And when you add this into them talking about moving the stock markets, it just seems like they're wanting to make Texas the focus of the financial center here in the United States. So here is another article from Texas Comptroller's website. I'm going to read the last 2 paragraphs of this. It says, in this issue, we also examine the Texas Bullion Depository, which is open for business in Leander, Texas, and that's just, I think, a little bit northwest of Austin, of the state capital. The Comptroller's office is responsible for its oversight and partners with Lone Star Tangible Assets to manage the facility's operations. When the Bullion Depository was preparing to launch in 2017, officials declared it would be an alternative to depositories located primarily in and around New York for precious metals owners seeking a storage vault. That's still true, but since then, the Bullion Depository has matured in important ways. And going further in that article, we have here Macy Douglas, who's a depository administrator, but going further in that article, they go on to talk about it has a couple of options. It's Tier 3 for gold. It also has lost storage for silver. They don't do silver as a Tier 3, which is a high security, because it takes so much silver, basically, to equal the same amount of gold. So they're putting in a little bit lesser secure area of the depository, but it is considered one of the safest depositories in the world. During the regular legislative session, the 87th legislature authorized the Texas Public Finance Authority and the Bond Review Board to sell and issue bonds to finance the acquisition of the facility from LSTA, and it seeks to address the long-term needs. So they're pretty serious about this. They're putting some debt behind it and involving state finances. What I found super interesting here and where I started digging more is they're talking about commodities. So they're talking about derivative markets. They're talking about potentially a replacement or a competitor for the COMEX, which is pretty big. We cover the COMEX a lot on our channel. We pay attention to it because that's really where spot prices are determined in the U.S. is the futures trade of COMEX. So it says here, in the world of financial trading, stock markets may readily come to mind. It's interesting they talk about stock markets, and we'll get into them potentially getting NASDAQ or NASDAQ talking to them. Arguably, more activity occurs daily in the commodities exchange market Food is one range. You're talking about agricultural products, beef, all of that kind of stuff. So not just talking about gold here, they're talking about all commodity derivatives, energy, agriculture, all of that stuff, potentially opening a market in Texas. This is huge because the markets that have been in the United States have primarily been focused in the Northeast for as long as I can recall United States in my research. In the world, let's see where we are. Commodities includes metals, which hold both industrial and economic value. One of the largest exchanges is for U.S. metals trading, COMEX. They mention COMEX specifically in the article on Texas Comptroller website, which originally stood for Commodity Exchange when it was founded in 1933, operates in New York. COMEX licenses 7 depository vaults in New York City and in Delaware. So they're setting up an alternative to COMEX, and they're even telling you that they're setting up an alternative to COMEX right here on the Texas government website. So very interesting. So that would not only be where gold could be stored, but where it's priced. And where it's priced, that's a lot of power, the pricing power for a commodity, because it's not only where the gold comes in, but trade is going to flow into that area in which people congregate to trade, and that's also how you control, how gold moves up and down is that derivative trade. Go on further here. With the Texas Bullion Depository in operation, I'm about midway down. A push is building in Texas for commodities trading options outside of New York, according to State Representative Giovanni Capriglione. I hope I said that correctly. The author of the bill created the Texas Bullion Depository. Texas is ideally positioned both geographically and economically to become an epicenter for commodities trading. So when they set up the Bullion Depository, they were wanting to move commodities trading to New York. I find this very, very interesting. To Texas. Why Texas? And why would there be an issue with New York? What could be the reasoning behind that? That's a fairly big move when you move a financial center, a world financial center, basically to the south or to another state. So here is an article that appeared at KSAT.com as a local NBC affiliate, I believe, for Austin, Texas, and they were reporting on how Governor Greg Abbott was meeting with NASDAQ and other stock exchanges. I'm thinking, S&P, Dow Jones, potentially, last November 20th. So one of the reasons this came about was because the state of New Jersey wanted to tax some of the transactions that come into, I guess, their data centers for the markets, and the exchanges didn't like it. It would raise about $10 billion for the state of New Jersey, but they didn't want to pay like a per transaction tax. Every time there was a transaction on the market, they would pay so many cents, I think was the scheme. And so that's part of the reason for them doing it. They don't want the government in New Jersey to tax it, but I'm wondering where that taxing proposal came from. Because if you're the state of New Jersey and you're New York or where some of these other markets trade, why would you tax the golden goose? Why would you kill the golden goose? So being a bit of a historian in the way that financial situations are determined. You look at Jekyll Island, the creation of the Federal Reserve, for example. Who is actually behind the move to push these markets out of New York and why? And I think it's going to be interesting in the next few years if this takes place, if they do end up moving the NASDAQ down to Texas, potentially the other stock markets and the derivatives markets as well, seeing in the news who's actually pushing this and why. And to me, that's part of the great global reset. When we talk about the reset, we talk about not only fiat currencies, potentially gold getting involved, maybe gold and silver revaluation, maybe the central bank digital currencies, and how 50 central banks are aligning with the BIS to develop those central bank digital currencies led by China. I talk about how the IMF is going to move their world headquarters over to China in a few years, and talk about how Basel III is going to change the gold market in London, possibly pull a lot of that trade out of London, maybe into China. And we'll talk about China here in a moment. There's a lot going on, and who's doing this? I think the news over the next 2 or 3 years is going to be fascinating to see why they're not only doing this in gold, but they're doing it for the rest of the financial sector at the same time. It's not just about gold. It's about all of our financial system and how that system runs and who controls it and why. And so I think there's going to be an incredible amount of news around this. This is getting almost zero press. We've talked about it on our website, and our YouTube channel. I don't see anybody else talking about this. But this is huge. This goes beyond just the pricing power of gold. This goes beyond debates that we had yesterday on Bitcoin versus gold. I mean, this is the world financial system. This is where prices are determined. This is where billions and even trillions of dollars move through. For the mortgage markets, for the stock market, all of these things, where interest rates are determined, where a lot of this stuff goes on. This is big stuff. Here we go. A little bit more from KSAT, the article. Officials from NASDAQ and other major stock exchanges will meet with Governor Greg Abbott on November 20th in Austin to discuss a possible move from New Jersey to Texas. The meeting, and this is reported by Dallas Morning News, which is the major newspaper in Dallas, as well as NBC DFW, which is the NBC affiliate, Channel 5 in Dallas as well. The meeting comes on the heels of the exchanges threatening to move their trading platforms out of New Jersey, and that's because of the taxing scheme that New Jersey has came up with for those trading platforms. According to the Dallas Morning News, Abbott's office has been talking with NASDAQ and other exchanges about moving their data centers to Dallas because of potential tax on financial transactions. The proposal tax would charge 1/4 cent per financial transactions at entities in New Jersey that process at least 10,000 transactions. And of course, you don't want to pay a tax on your transactions because it plays havoc with all of your trading schemas, because if you're putting a tax in there and you're trading a lot of trades which make a little bit of money, that taxation could ruin that trade, and it could affect all of your algorithms, all of your trading strategies, everything that you have set up. So I understand why they would want to do it. And on the heels of that, Element Critical expands Texas presence with Austin data center acquisition. So this data center, as the article goes on to talk about, Yahoo Finance is capable of handling these type of stock markets. So at the same time Governor Abbott is talking about this, a big data center company is coming in, refurbishing some existing data centers to make them capable of handling this trade, so that they could, rival the ones up in New Jersey and New York. So very interesting. A lot of this infrastructure is already being put into place. And then, of course, Tennessee gets in the act. Tennessee would be the second state to establish a bullion repository if they do. Their Senate voted 32-0 to explore the possibility, which means they're probably going to do something. So if you think about it, bullion depositories moving south, one in Texas, one in Tennessee, you've got redundancy there. You've got two options there. It seems to me that potentially the gold trade could be moving south. And there are some resources we had. This is just the presentation I did on YouTube. If we could load the other presentation on China, please. So while she's loading the presentation on China, any questions about what we had on NASDAQ or anything moving to Texas? Yes?
I'm not trying to get off in the weeds about secession and stuff like that.
Yeah.
There's the talk that if that would ever happen, Texas would be one of the states that would do that. Does that factor, I'm not trying to get off in the weeds of that side, but does that factor into what's going on with Texas?
Potentially, there's a big secession movement. I don't, honestly, I don't know with the Democratic presence in the state growing like it is, if we ever could get a secession vote in Texas. But could it be that certain states are aligning with each other and there could be like a bifurcation in the financial markets that may have something to do with political realignment that's going on in the country? Yes. I mean, that's possible, for sure. Yeah. That's my question, because taxes are an issue, but that's not something that's been settled. It's been proposed. And for the exchanges to go off really quickly and say, we want to move to Texas, to me, I agree with you. I think the taxes is a narrative. Is that strong enough of a narrative to explain why they're considering moving the financial center south? I don't think so. I think there's other stuff there, and that's why I think the news is going to be very interesting while we'll be following it. Well, I'm scraping the internet right now for just whatever I can find about this. Yes?
How convenient would it be if the markets do completely freeze up, everything trading suspended, and they reopen?
Like a bank closure, but for like the stock markets?
Everything.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, part of the Great Reset is not only a currency reset, wouldn't it be a market reset as well? It would be a revaluation of everything. So maybe this is in preparation for that potentially, I don't know. But my question is why I live in Texas. Why Texas? Texas has never been considered a financial center. We have financial services companies. I think Schwab moved some of their financial services down, but we're just talking like brokerages. So it's interesting. And what is the impetus behind Texas specifically? There's something else behind that, I think, that has to do with geopolitical realignment and those types of factors, but I can't find enough information on it. So if anybody knows, email me at Robert@GoldSilver Pros. Any other questions? Yes.
I would just say I wouldn't underestimate simple arrogance of the politicians. The Texas governor is like, he seems like, in my opinion, he would like to make Texas, the empire of the world, so to speak. And there are some reasons you think of climate change. I mean, for these vaults in New York City underground, you look at global sea
I know one of them is underground, yeah. Well, to defend our good governor in the state of Texas, I would disagree with you. I don't think he's trying to take over the world or anything, but I do think he's very pro-business. Pro-business to the point of he'll do anything to keep business in Texas. That includes giving tax incentives and things like that. So pro-business means we're open for business in Texas, and he is very much an advocate of that.
Would like to control business from Texas.
I don't know that you could control business from Texas. Texas was at one point the 8th largest economy, in the world, and that was probably 10 years ago. I don't know what it is now by itself. So I don't think, and that was before Governor Greg Abbott. That was just because Texas is an awesome place to live. But I don't think we need Governor Abbott to control the world. And personally, I don't know if he's doing a deal with the devil. I don't want the markets to move to Texas personally, because that brings the banking industry down here, and I don't want it. If you think about the money that goes into lobbying, who is now controlling the governorship if Wall Street moves to Texas? And would what happened to New York with their political system also happen in Texas? That's what I don't want to see personally. That's just my personal opinion. Any other questions before we move to China? Okay, second presentation is China. This is a different video that I did. At about the same time I'm seeing changes in markets moving to Texas, I see China. And I think, okay, is this also part of the global reset and the de-emphasis of London as potentially the granddaddy of all the gold markets? So in Reuters, it was reported that China would draw foreign investors into commodities future trading. Now, China has always had a commodities markets, at least for the last 30 years, but it was relegated to iron, oil futures, and a few other things. It was small market, but they're expanding it greatly. So it says here, China will launch more futures contracts, including a shipping futures contract. Now, we all have seen what's happened to containers and shipping rates and backups in the shipping industry. And this seems very timely to that, in that China may want to have some price control power and influence in the overall shipping industry, maybe to also facilitate more shipments into their markets as well by offering those shipping futures trade. Accelerate efforts to bring in more overseas investors to trade in its future market, the State Council or Cabinet said on Friday. China will launch more futures contracts, including shipping futures contract. They will establish an international non-dollar yuan-denominated commodity futures market, it said in a statement promoting trade and investment as free trade zones. So again, de-dollarization. The de-dollarization in the oil trade, basically the death of the petrodollar, I think, has already happened. You see the agreements with Saudi Arabia, political agreements between Russia with Saudi Arabia and Nigeria. You see the Belt and Road Initiative with China. Now you've got a alternative currency, fully open, fully developed commodities market being developed in China. It says, with the country gradually opening up more commodities derivative contracts to overseas participants or trading, China will accelerate the introduction of overseas traders, build an international commodity futures market priced and settled in renminbi, and develop widely representative futures prices that domestic and foreign traders will recognize and participate in. Also reported in FX Street, main takeaways will accelerate and bring in overseas investors into domestic futures trading, so China is now open for business. We'll launch more futures contracts, including shipping futures, and we'll launch pilot schemes for intellectual property rights securitization. Anybody, I'm curious as to what this means, and I don't know. Anybody know why China would want to be a player in intellectual property rights securitization? Does this have anything to do with their smart contracts and their digital currency system, perhaps? Anybody have any thoughts on that? I know there are people that understand that market better than I do. Yes?
Just to say it's kind of obvious. I mean, they don't like our intellectual property rights security system. So yeah, it's like just we're going to get those U.S. folks from Austin and New York City, and they can sit under our system for a while. And they're the largest gold producer, and they will be for a long time. So they're just trying to do what we did 100 years ago.
I was going to say, it's kind of rich to,
It's a box watching.
they've been stealing our intellectual property for the last 30 years.
Of course they have.
Now they're saying, okay, we're going to block. Now that we're starting to produce our own intellectual property.
Yeah.
If I have time, I'll talk about the case of Nortel and how Huawei is basically Nortel 2.0. I don't know if I'll have time to talk about that, but the Chinese military invaded Nortel's systems, took all their intellectual property, and built Huawei. So Huawei was what Nortel used to be. using the same technology in engineering. Okay, the China Security Regulatory Commission, CSRC, the country's top securities regulator, said Friday it will further expand the scope of specific futures varieties and enhance participation of overseas traders and support financial institutions, so on and so forth. And of course, who is the first trader that's going to be doing commodities there is JP Morgan. The top securities regulator in June granted approval, allowing JP Morgan Futures Co. to become the country's first wholly foreign-owned futures trading firm. Is that a surprise to anybody sitting in this room? This year marks the 30th anniversary of the launch of the Chinese futures market. At the end of November, funds in Chinese future market had exceeded 855.95 billion yuan, which is about 130.5 billion US dollars, up 55.2% on the year. So they've already got traders in the markets and increasing, volume. Meanwhile, the turnover in China's future market reached 382.5 trillion yuan, up 45.5% year on year in November. The commodities future available to international investors has been operating smoothly, such as crude oil and iron ore futures, which they've had, I guess, for those 30 years. According to International Energy Exchange in Shanghai, a unit of the Shanghai Futures Exchange, it has registered 52 overseas agencies, mainly trading from Hong Kong, Singapore, Britain. That's an interesting one. The Republic of Korea and Japan, which serve customers from Britain, Australia, Switzerland, Singapore, Cyprus, Seychelles, as well as Hong Kong and Taiwan. So Britain got involved in financing the Belt and Road Initiative, and now they're involved in Chinese futures market. So they're pretty smart. They know what's happening in China. They know that China's rising as a power, and they're going to put their money with the lead horse in the race, I guess. Rochelle Wei, CEO of JP Morgan Futures Co., said as China continues to open its futures market and launch new varieties of products, the country's market will play more of an important role in the world market, and more overseas investors will join in. So references there. I think I'm done with that presentation. So any questions on China? Yes?
And you're talking on Texas. I appreciate Texas always thinks big. I can see no reason. You gave a lot of reasons why Texas would like to have those markets move down there. You gave very few reasons as to why those markets would really want to move out of New York and go down there.
I think the taxation issue was a reason given, but I think there's another reason. I don't think it's a strong enough reason. But there's a lot of smoke around that, and maybe it's just a threat, but I don't necessarily think it is.
There's a lot of smoke around a lot of things that come out of Texas.
Yeah. So what if China connects 73% of the world's economies together in the Belt and Road Initiative, and they have more loans in yuan than, say, our dollar-based loans? Would companies want to trade in their markets to facilitate getting involved in all of those billions and potentially?
As long as you can make money, they'll trade there. And as soon as they can't make money anymore, they'll pull out just as fast as they went in.
But how often does that change, though? When's the last time anybody pulled out of New York or London?
It can change pretty damn fast. I was in China.
100 years? 200 years? How long have London and New York been operating as financial markets?
China was in chaos and incredible
Yeah.
poverty in the mid-1980s when I went in. And they've had this
Yeah.
revolution in their economy right now. And it can go down just as fast as it went up.
So who's been a dominant superpower in the world stage longer, China or the United States? How many thousands of years was China the predominant power in the Eastern Hemisphere? Before anybody ever, before we met the Native Americans in the United States and formed a government. So I think if you're thinking the last 20 or 30 years, I understand your viewpoint. If you're thinking the last 5,000 years, I think I disagree with you. I would say be careful of discounting the rise in China. There's a lot of power building in China. And it's being built with international money. It's not just being built with Chinese yuan. There are major global banks that are big players in China, yes. Right. They do. They have a succession of 5-year plans, but I don't think, my personal opinion is I don't think the Communist Party ever went away. I think they just kind of went into the background. And they allowed capitalism to flourish in sort of in agreement with the communists or whoever the ruling party is. If you look at Nortel, for example, which is the big Canadian telecom, and I gave this presentation about 8 years ago because I worked in cybersecurity for Verizon. So I gave this presentation at Verizon. Nortel, when they collapsed, were the size of what Verizon, AT&T are combined today. It was about, in today's dollar, about half $1 trillion company. And what had happened was the Chinese had gone in and stolen all of Nortel's intellectual property. And their lead security guy, his name's Brian, I forget his last name, was on MSNBC documenting all the logs of them stealing everything. And he went to the CEO of Nortel. And the CEO refused to believe it, even though he had the logs and the IP addresses, and he knew exactly, he mapped out exactly the building in which the hackers in China were stealing the information from. And he had satellite photos. And the CEO didn't do anything about it, because this is back before cybersecurity became a big industry like it is now. And what happens, they took all that, they gave it to Huawei, because the Chinese military has offices in the Huawei building. They handed it over to Huawei, and this is documented in Canadian newspapers as they did the research. And they built Huawei up. Huawei went over to Canada and started taking their business. So China has been doing this to, I anticipate, US and Canadian and other Western countries for a very long time. The original stealing of data from Nortel, I think, happened in the mid-90s, and it went for about 10 years. He said he had 10 years of logs showing China had been stealing everything they've been developing for 10 years before they found it. So, yes, go ahead.
I think the US has a really big problem because I disagree respectfully with that statement. 50% of GDP is now government expenditure.
Mm-hmm.
We are essentially a bad economy. Free market capitalism has not been around for a long time.
No.
So we're in a distorted situation. We haven't got the advantages of either.
We're looking from a lens of a couple of centuries in modern history. We're not looking at a very, very, very long-term lens, and I think some of the things here are speaking more to a long-term change in world geopolitics and world trade and world finance. I do agree with this gentleman that the overzealousness of the Chinese system of government probably will harm their advance in both the Belt and Road Initiative and also opening up their derivatives markets, but I think they're pretty smart. I mean, China learned from the Western nations, stole a lot of its technology, stole its processes, invited companies in and basically took it. And they built quite an impressive economy, and it's going along full steam. Now they have debt problems. Some of their state-owned entities are having a lot of issues. You have the Evergrande situation, the potential for maybe systemic debt contagion. But they're smart. They adapt very quickly, and I would not underestimate them. Any other questions on either China or Texas? Yeah, so I kind of went in. I touched on it, yeah. So Nortel was this huge Canadian telecom, and the story around Nortel was they just made bad business decisions and they collapsed. So when I got first involved in cybersecurity about 10 years ago, I was doing research for Verizon on potential threats to the company. And I was the lead auditor for network and security for the company. So I do audit reports, and they go to executive management, and we would make recommendations on how to facilitate cybersecurity, because we knew the Chinese were coming in. We just didn't know how. And we had the logs too, but we didn't have the systems developed to prevent it. So I did a lot of research, and I found the Nortel example, and basically, back in that day, the telecom, it's funny because the telecoms run the internet, right? But they didn't have their own security. We didn't have security. And the Chinese figured this out. So as soon as the internet basically got up and running, they started hacking all the telecom companies and taking their intellectual property. And not only that, if you think about it, most of the government agencies have assets in telecom data centers, like Verizon, AT&T, Windstream, all of the American telecom companies, and all of the traffic flow comes across our transport networks. So the Chinese are sitting there on the American telecom networks. They're seeing everything. They're seeing intellectual property flow from any industry in the United States. They're seeing they can get into public universities. In fact, I went to Black Hat in Las Vegas a few years ago, and there was a report, I think it was by McAfee and Intel, talking about what the Chinese were targeting. And a few years ago, it was all the universities. They were stealing all of our research and stealing all of our presentations, all the PhD papers. And they do it a lot through the telecoms, but they also invade, university websites and things. And in any case, in the case of Nortel, they stole all of their engineering diagrams, and it took them about 10 years. It took 10 years to steal it and reverse engineer it, but they reverse engineer it, built the product. And it was funny, one of the Canadian newspapers reported on that and said, when Huawei approached Canadian companies as a competitor for Nortel and providing service, they had a manual which had Nortel on it that they handed over to that company and said, well, this is how you use our product. They didn't bother even putting their own logo on it and changing it, So they had literally just taken Nortel, stolen their property, went and underpriced them, took all of their customers, and Nortel collapsed. And that, again, in today's dollar, was about a $500 billion company at the time. It was like 33% of the Canadian stock market, Nortel was, when it collapsed. It was huge. It was bigger than anything you'll see in the U.S. stock market. Bigger effect than if Apple collapsed tomorrow. Yes.
I got a question. This might not be, I may not know what I'm talking about, but what's
Sure.
happened to the Japanese economy? Why aren't they gonna sit back and say, are they gonna sit back and look at this and say, oh, are you kidding me? Is China really gonna take over? Is the Japanese are as strong as they were, and now they just kind of sit back and let this all happen?
I'm not an expert on Japan. I think there are people who probably could comment on that a little bit better. My understanding is they have huge debt issues and demographic issues, which may prevent them from becoming as strong a player in the financial markets, but I am no expert on Japan, so I may defer to somebody else to answer that question. Oh, one other interesting thing that happened I saw in the news last week. We have the Five Eyes Intelligence Network, which is Japan, US, Australia, who are the other two? Is it Canada and Britain? Well, the BRIC nations just signed their own agreement. So not only did they have trade in commodities markets and the Belt and Road Initiative, they also signed their own intelligence agreement. And what's interesting is India has put up more satellites, spy satellites and communication satellites in the last few years than like almost all the other nations combined. And so they've built this huge intelligence network in space, and they signed an intelligence sharing agreement. So now you see not only the polarization of trade between the BRIC nations and the traditional Western nations, but you see it in these deals that Russia and China are doing with these countries for energy, and you're seeing it in intelligence sharing. So we're definitely seeing, the Axis and allies, if you will, being reformed, just in a different format than we saw before. Any other questions? All right, thank you everybody so much for attending this. Somebody's next. I don't know who's next. I would introduce him, but appreciate all of your questions. I'll be in the workshop room here, I want to say at 10:40, and I'll be doing a session on valuing mining stocks. We'll be using some different accounting methods to value mining stocks, and we're going to talk about doing that in a down commodity cycle. Thank you, everybody. Appreciate it.